I'm on my way.
The Freedom Rides of 1961 were a simple but daring plan to deliberately violate the segregation laws of the Deep South.
I won't turn back.
There's a possibility that we might be arrested. This is the only trouble that I anticipate.
You could see baseball bats and pieces of pipe.
The women, they were screaming, kill them niggas. And they had babies in their arms.
One fella had a pitchfork.
We will make sure that people traveling in interstate commerce and traveling across our highways are not molested. That's all I ask for.
And you just can't guarantee the safety of a fool, and that's what these folks are, just fools.
I told the operator to tell the president that I was not there. I lied. I just lied.
Maybe it takes something like this for the federal government to see that Alabama is not going to place any limit upon itself. It must be imposed from without.
It was horrible. It was like a scene from hell. It was the worst suffering I'd ever heard.
There was that feeling. I'd just like to punch some of them damn agitators right in the face. I gotta hate somebody. I got to hate somebody.
You're saying that you're going to start a movement and then you quit. Your parents tell you, don't start something that you can't finish.
The 1960s were a time in which African Americans faced many challenges and social injustice. The Civil Rights Movement brought out many influential black figures and events throughout the country, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, John Lewis, the Freedom Riders, Malcolm X, and many more. The goal of these figures was to gain equality for not just African Americans, but everyone. Different strategies were used all throughout the United States, with one of those getting the name, the Freedom Riders. The original Freedom Riders were a group of 13 activists composed of 7 African Americans and 6 whites, who were motivated because of the segregated bus terminals. The group would try to use whites-only restrooms and eat in whites-only restaurants, but received plenty of backlash from the racist South.
During the 1960s, African Americans lacked many civil rights, one of which being the right to sit wherever they want in buses. Enraged at the unequal civil rights, the African Americans began to boycott riding buses, which caused them to walk everywhere they needed to go instead of taking transportation. Because of this, the Freedom Riders emerged. The Freedom Riders challenged the ruling of the United States Supreme Court cases in 1946 when the U.S. Supreme Court banned segregation in interstate bus travels. This ruling was not enforced whatsoever, causing many Africans to be enraged. In order to oppose segregation in the transportation sector and challenge the Morgan v. Virginia and the Boynton v. Virginia case, both of which made segregation illegal, the Freedom Riders decided to ride interstate buses into the segregated South United States in 1961. Their path the Freedom Riders planned to take was to start at Washington, D.C. and end at New Orleans.
The approach that the Freedom Riders took in order to combat segregation in the transportation sector was a Gandhian approach due to James Lawson. As one of the most well-known leaders of the Freedom Riders, Lawson also became the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference after MLK's death. Lawson preached the use of nonviolence and civil disobedience in order to gain positive social change. Lawson told reporters that the Freedom Riders would rather risk violence and be able to travel like ordinary passengers than rely on armed guards who did not understand their philosophy of combating violence and hate by absorbing it without returning it in kind.
On May 14, 1961, the Freedom Riders arrived in Anniston, Alabama, where they were greeted by the Ku Klux Klan. The bus driver couldn't stop at the desired destination and was forced to keep going. The Klan and other angry members of the mob followed the bus themselves and eventually blew out the wheels of the bus. This led to someone throwing a bomb on the bus, which sparked a massive fire, forcing the passengers to flee from the bus. In the heart of the racist South, the Freedom Riders now were left stranded and were beaten without mercy. After the first bus massacre, a second bus arrived in Birmingham, Alabama, where the passengers were also brutally beaten with metal pipes. The Freedom Riders had no protection from law enforcement, as Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner Bull Connors stated that he didn't post police protection at the bus stops because it was Mother's Day. Here's a clip from one of the surviving Freedom Riders recapping what he remembers from the tragedy.
I was along about the middle of the bus, I guess, and they eventually broke out a window just behind me, and that's where they threw this firebomb in this seat just behind me. And suddenly, before you knew anything, smoke was all over the place, the darkest smoke you ever saw. You couldn't see very much, and so I just put a handkerchief over my mouth and nose, and I stayed on as long as possible. It started getting pretty hot, and I got off. Flames started popping up, you know. And I tell you, people were crawling around, bent over, coughing, trying to get the smoke out of their chest. They were still whacking people with chains and whatnot if they could get to them. It was one of the more horrible scenes you would see.
The Freedom Riders used nonviolent protests as that was the only way African Americans could fight for their rights at the time. As they were met with brutality of the Ku Klux Klan and many racist whites, many Americans that ignored the issue of civil rights suddenly started to support African Americans when they saw the brutality that African Americans were met with thanks to media coverage. Overall, the Freedom Rider movement helped raise awareness of the unenforced laws that allowed buses to integrate. Because of this, African Americans were able to achieve transportation rights quicker, which, in conclusion, makes the Freedom Rider movement a huge success in achieving equal civil rights for African Americans.